ITA for not returning a tool. My neighbor lent me because he never gives back the stuff he borrows. Hey, can I borrow that ladder again? Greg, my neighbor, stood in my driveway with the audacity of a man who believes borrowing means permanently owning. He leaned against his truck, casually spinning a wrench in his hand. Not just any wrench, my wrench. A wrench I hadn't seen in months. Greg wasn't embarrassed. He grinned like he was doing me a favor by even returning it. But before I could ask where the rest of my stuff was, he followed up with, "You're not using it, right?" This wasn't the first time Greg had borrowed something from me. When I first moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago, Greg seemed like the ideal neighbor. He came over with a 6-pack of beer, introduced himself, and offered to help me set up my grill. Friendly, talkative, the type who always waved when you passed his house. I thought we'd hit it off. But Greg quickly revealed his true nature. He had a habit of borrowing things. And by borrowing, I mean taking them indefinitely. It started small. He borrowed a hammer for a quick fix and returned it weeks later, scratched and covered in some kind of adhesive. Then he needed my electric drill, which never came back. When I asked about it, he laughed and said, "Are you sure you didn't misplace it? Check your garage again, buddy." I checked. It wasn't there. Over time, Greg's requests got bigger. One weekend, he borrowed my lawnmower. Just for a day, he promised. 2 months later, I had to knock on his door to get it back. When he finally returned it, it was missing a wheel. His excuse? "It still works, doesn't it?" That was Greg's thing. He'd shrug off any inconvenience he caused, acting like I was the one overreacting. And for a while, I let it slide. I told myself it wasn't worth the hassle. But the list of missing tools kept growing. My garden shears, a weed whacker, a set of extension cords. It was like Greg had secretly decided to stock his garage with my belongings. The ladder was my breaking point. Greg had borrowed it twice before, each time keeping it way longer than necessary. The last time, I'd needed it to fix a light in my attic. But when I called Greg to ask for it back, his phone went straight to voicemail. I ended up balancing on an old chair and nearly fell trying to reach the fixture. So when Greg showed up asking for the ladder again, I finally put my foot down. "No," I said, crossing my arms. "Not until you return the other stuff you've borrowed." Greg's grin faltered, but only for a second. "Oh, come on," he said, chuckling like I was joking. "You know I always bring stuff back." "Do you?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because last I checked, you still have my drill, my garden shears, and my weed whacker. Where are they, Greg?" Greg scratched his head, pretending to think. "Oh, I'm pretty sure I already gave those back." "Maybe check your garage again." That was his go-to move, gaslighting. Make me feel like the forgetful one. But I wasn't falling for it this time. "I've checked," I said firmly. "They're not there because you still have them." Greg rolled his eyes and threw his hands up dramatically. All right, he said. "I'll bring them over this weekend. Just let me borrow the ladder and we'll call it even." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe his nerve. "No, Greg. That's not how this works." His friendly demeanor evaporated. "Wow," he said, shaking his head. "I didn't realize you were so petty. It's just a ladder, man. You're really gonna be that guy?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I'm going to be that guy who doesn't let you take more of my stuff without returning what you've already borrowed." Greg muttered something under his breath about me ruining the neighborly vibe, and walked off, leaving me standing in the driveway, fuming. I thought that was the end of it. But with Greg, it's never that simple. The next morning I woke up to the sound of hammering. Confused, I looked out the window and saw Greg in his backyard, balancing on my ladder. My ladder, which I had explicitly told him he couldn't borrow. My blood boiled. How had he even gotten it? Then it hit me. I'd left it leaning against the side of my garage the night before, assuming Greg wouldn't stoop so low as to just take it. Clearly, I'd overestimated him. I stormed over to his yard, trying to keep my anger in check. "Greg!" I shouted. He turned around, grinning like he'd just won a prize. "What the hell are you doing with my ladder?" Greg shrugged, like it was no big deal. "You weren't using it," he said, continuing to hammer whatever half-assed project he was working on. "I told you you couldn't borrow it," I snapped. "And you just took it anyway?" "Relax, man," Greg said, climbing down the ladder with infuriating calmness. "I'll bring it back when I'm done." "No harm, no foul." "No harm?" I repeated, incredulous. "This is theft, Greg. You can't just take people's stuff whenever you want." "It's not theft," Greg said, rolling his eyes. "It's borrowing. You're making a big deal out of nothing." That was Greg's MO. Turn the situation around to make me look like the bad guy. But this time, I wasn't backing down. "Bring it back, now," I demanded. "Can't," he said, brushing past me. "I'm in the middle of something." I stood there, fuming, as Greg walked back into his house like he hadn't just blatantly disrespected me. This wasn't just about the ladder anymore. It was about respect, something Greg clearly didn't have for me or anyone else. That's when I decided enough was enough. If Greg wasn't going to respect my property, then I wasn't going to respect his. I marched back to my garage, grabbed the wrench he'd conveniently returned the day before, and headed straight for his tool shed. Now, let me be clear. I wasn't planning to steal anything. I just wanted to see if my suspicions were correct. And sure enough, the moment I opened the shed, I saw it. There, in the middle of Greg's cluttered mess, was my drill. My drill that he'd claimed I'd misplaced over a year ago. It wasn't even hidden. It was sitting on a shelf, plain as day, like it had been his all along. I grabbed it, and as I started looking around, I found more. My garden shears, buried under a pile of extension cords. My weed whacker, shoved in a corner, covered in cobwebs. Even my toolbox, sitting on a workbench with some of Greg's tools mixed in like he'd just absorbed it into his collection. I couldn't believe it. It was like stumbling into a treasure trove of all the things I thought I'd lost. I carried everything back to my garage, making multiple trips. By the time I was done, I'd recovered half my garage, and just as I was about to grab the ladder from his backyard, Greg came storming out of his house. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted, his face red with anger. "Taking back what's mine," I said, holding up the drill like it was Exhibit A. Greg looked at the drill, then at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "I was going to return that," he finally said. "When?" I shot back. "After you broke it, or after you decided it was yours?" By now, a small crowd had gathered. Beth from across the street was peeking out her window, and Mike, the guy who lives 2 houses down, was pretending to walk his dog, but clearly just eavesdropping. "You're being ridiculous," Greg said, crossing his arms. "It's not like I stole anything. I was just borrowing it." "Borrowing," I repeated, holding up my garden shears. "You've had these for 6 months, Greg. 6 months. Greg shrugged, looking genuinely confused as to why I was upset. "You weren't using them," he said. "That doesn't matter," I yelled. "It's my stuff. You don't get to decide when I'm done with it." Greg muttered something about me being dramatic, and stormed back inside. But as satisfying as it was to get my things back, I knew Greg wasn't going to let this go. And I was right. The next day I woke up to something odd. My garbage cans tipped over, their contents strewn across my driveway. At first, I thought it was raccoons. But then I saw the footprints. Not animal footprints, human ones, leading straight back to Greg's yard. I was livid. This was his petty way of getting back at me for standing up to him. I decided to let it slide, thinking he'd get bored and move on. But Greg wasn't done. Later that afternoon, I noticed my hose was missing. I searched everywhere before spotting it coiled neatly in Greg's backyard, attached to his faucet. When I confronted him about it, he grinned and said, "Oh, I thought you wouldn't mind. You weren't using it." That was Greg's favorite excuse. You weren't using it. As if my property was up for grabs the moment it left my hands. "I do mind, Greg," I said, trying to stay calm. "You can't just take my stuff without asking." Greg shrugged. "It's just a hose. Relax." "It's not about the hose," I snapped. "It's about respect. You keep treating my property like it's yours, and I'm done with it." Greg rolled his eyes, muttering something about me being a terrible neighbor, before walking back inside. I stood there, fuming, wondering how someone could be so entitled. But Greg's antics didn't stop there. The next morning, I found a passive-aggressive note taped to my front door. It read, "If you're going to be this uptight about your stuff, maybe you should move to a neighborhood where people don't share." I couldn't believe it. Greg was acting like I was the bad guy for not letting him take whatever he wanted. I debated going to the neighborhood association, but I didn't want to escalate things. Instead, I decided to handle it myself. That evening, I waited until Greg went inside, then walked over to his backyard and took my ladder back. If he wasn't going to respect boundaries, then I wasn't going to play nice anymore. The next day, Greg came stomping over, red-faced and furious. "Where's the ladder?" he demanded. "It's in my garage," I said calmly. "Where it belongs." "You can't just take it back," Greg yelled. I laughed. "Oh, so it's fine when you take my stuff, but when I take it back, it's a problem?" Greg opened his mouth to argue, but quickly realized he didn't have a leg to stand on. "This is why no one in the neighborhood likes you," he finally said, before storming off. For a moment, I wondered if he was right. Was I being unreasonable? Was I overreacting? But then I remembered all the times Greg had lied, manipulated, and outright stolen from me. No, I wasn't the problem here. Since then, Greg has avoided me, which, honestly, has been a blessing. I finally have all my tools back and my garage feels like mine again. But every now and then I catch him glaring at me from his yard, probably plotting his next move. So, Reddit, AITA for refusing to lend Greg the ladder and taking my stuff back? Or did Greg finally get what he deserved? Thank you for watching. Tell us what you would do in this situation.